But this war has had a lasting impact upon both countries due to its violent nature and to China's use of superior force against the Vietnamese people. Hi, this is Anita with the Dusty Roads podcast, which is all about living your life as a global citizen. And, as part of that, we like to talk a little bit about some of the history and other things, just because we're a great believer that history helps us to be able to understand a bit more about the present. And many people may not be aware, but China and Vietnam were once at war. And quite recently, they were at war. Like when I say recently, I say within the last, 50 or 100 years that the China and Vietnam were at war with each other. There was a Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. And this really was one of the most significant conflicts between these two countries in recent history. It only lasted about a month, from February 17th to March 16th in 1979. And it really resulted in China's invasion of Vietnam. But this war has had a lasting impact upon both countries due to its violent nature and to China's use of superior force against the Vietnamese people. The reasons of the attack or why it happened is still a bit debated today, but still, it largely stemmed from China's dissatisfaction with Vietnamese Communist government and their support of the Cambodian rebels fighting against the Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge forces. Added to this was China's concern about, the Vietnamese receiving Soviet influences from Vietnam and feared that Vietnam would become a type of proletariat of the Soviet Union. At the time, if you recall, if you know your history, America had just lost the war in Vietnam. And so Vietnam, being a small country, they were quite proud of the fact that they, won the war against the mighty American force. And so the Vietnamese were sort of bragging about the fact that they were the most powerful military in the world because they had beaten the United States in the Vietnam War. So they started bragging about this, and this bragging about the war really led to China being very nervous about the Vietnamese military power. So, all of this sort of added to the fact that about this war happening. I guess there's a couple of lessons you can learn here. Number one is, to really let your neighbor or someone who may even be your enemy, to let them know what your intentions are. And number two is maybe don't brag about things so much because you don't know what's going to happen or what it's going to cause. Because in this instance, it caused a huge loss of life on both sides. So China wanted to show its strength and wanted to show that they were the regional superpower, that China was a country that could not be messed with during this time. So China decided that they would invade Vietnam. So during this conflict, over 200,000 Chinese soldiers invaded Vietnam. And China's, invasion, of course, resulted in a victory for China, but it also resulted in a heavy loss of lives and damage for the Vietnamese people. Of the 200,000 troops, China was estimated to have lost 20,000 troops, while Vietnam suffered more than 33,000 casualties. So both sides of the war lost quite a few people in the war. In addition, both sides sort of had problems. They suffered, very heavy casualties on both sides. But what it did is it left this lasting impact between China and Vietnam that still, even today, you can even still see some of this impact of this war. And you can see some animosity even between these two countries because of this war that happened. First of all, the number one thing was there was heavy losses, as we mentioned before, on both sides. And there's many that were dead or missing in action. The second was that it deepened the animosity between Vietnam and China. Even today, from time to time, you might see some anti-Chinese sentiment in Vietnam. I've seen, where there's been some protests against the Chinese. There's many times we send things across the border between China and Vietnam, and sometimes the border just closes for no reason at all. There could be this, back and forth, this tit for tat with trade going on between the two countries. You have to remember, too, throughout this history is that Vietnam was under Chinese rule for 1,000 years. So, Vietnam understands clearly what it means to be under Chinese rule. But at the same time, they're no longer under Chinese rule. So there's many Vietnamese who maybe don't feel very good about the Chinese. Even from time to time, for me, I've heard every once in a while I might hear some negative comments, but the Chinese are no good or this or that from some Vietnamese who may feel very strongly about this. So you might find some anti-Chinese sentiment there. Vietnam was, forced to introduce a period of economic austerity because of this war. Because really they had to rebuild its infrastructure and its resources. And, you have to remember that they just came off of the war with America. So, this is the country that had been battered and been at war for a huge amount of time. And suddenly now they had this other war with China. So it just really caused a lot of hardship to the Vietnamese people. It also increased military spending on both sides. So both China and Vietnam started doing a huge increase in military spending, which started to negatively affect their economies. So not only were the people, didn't have a lot of food, they were hurting financially. Both countries were cut off from the rest of the world. At the same time, the governments were spending a lot of money on military aid and military things to be able to show their military might, instead of spending money and investing money in their economies. There were several, border disputes between these two countries. And as I've mentioned before, over the years of being here, sending things back and forth across the border between the two countries, a lot of times the borders can be closed for no reason at all. They just close them. When are they open? We don't know. Sometimes you have to wait. Sometimes they come through. Sometimes they don't. So even the border itself can be open and closed. The Sino-Vietnamese War resulted in increased Chinese aggression towards other nations in Southeast Asia. That's why Vietnam started aligning themselves with other Asian nations as Japan and Korea. And the Soviet Union started to assist Vietnam. And so, now a lot of other, countries in Southeast Asia are a little afraid of China. You see that happening today, what's been happening to some of the things in the South China Seas and other things. On the bright side of all of this, and the bright side of this with the conflict is in recent years, China and Vietnam have understood that we are neighbors and we need each other. There's a lot of Chinese investment in Vietnam, particularly as the United States has instituted a lot of duties and taxes and tariffs upon China. Many of the factories have moved to Vietnam. So you do find a lot of Chinese investment in Vietnam. And you also found that the two countries have decided that they need to be more friendly, that they need to work together better, that they need to be able to understand their differences more and to work with diplomacy. So this is a really interesting thing to study about this war, because if you don't understand it, you may not understand why some of the Vietnamese feel this animosity. And most people may not even understand that there ever was a war that went on between these two countries, but it did. And even still today, you can still see this lasting impact of the war and what it had upon the people here. You may even find some anti-Chinese sentiment here, like I have found here from time to time. Now, I want to point out that if you are Chinese, you don't need to worry about traveling here. Your life is not in danger. The Vietnamese will not come after you. I have not seen any of that happen. But at the same time, you need to also understand, if you do happen to see some or hear some Chinese negative things about China by a Vietnamese, maybe you can understand why. Maybe they were greatly affected by this war that happened and only lasted 30 days, and all those people died within that time. This is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast, where it's all about living life as a global citizen. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and enjoy being part of our community. We will put a link to this blog into our description if you'd like to be able to read more about this war and understand more about this war and the impact that it's had upon particularly Vietnam and China and the relations between China and Vietnam. We'd like to thank our team who helps put this together, our podcast together, specifically Rico. And we'd like to thank all of you, our listeners. We know without you, this would not be possible. Thank you so much for listening.